I'm Greg Kesich. I'm the editorial page editor of the Portland Press Herald, and I am here with the Sunday columnists Bill Nemitz, Caron and Cynthia Dill, and we are looking at the news of the week. And Bill, there's been a lot of protests going on, but this week one of the protests from last summer ended up in court. I know you were interested in that.
Well, I was interested in what happened this week when they finally were gathering for this restorative justice session between, I think it was 17, if I recall, 17 protesters. And
this was the Black Lives Matter, protest
group,
of last summer.
Who you'll recall pretty much shut down Commercial Street for a period of time last summer. I don't know. I watched this thing unfold, and my understanding is that they all showed up and that the agreement that had been hammered out in court had called for 2 sessions, half and half of this rather large group, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, speaking with the police chief and the assistant district attorney. As they gathered en masse, apparently the protesters decided that no, they wanted 1 session. They also, I wasn't there, but I read that they also objected to having a representative of the main American Civil Liberties and also Rachel Talbot Ross, representing, I believe, the NAACP. I came away from this thinking simply that, and it kind of goes back to the protest from the summer too, and I'm a big believer in protest. I mean, I can remember when I was young and doing that kind of thing, but it's always the thing that's always struck me about protest is that the ultimate goal with any protest is to persuade, is to loudly raise an issue and through your action persuade people to at least consider your point of view and preferably to come around to it. And as I watched this all unfold yesterday and watched this whole process dissolve, it left me pretty much with the same feeling I had last summer, and that is there's a lot of protesting going on, but I don't see a lot of persuasion. And I feel like what happened yesterday worked very much to the detriment of these kids.
I guess so. I thought while I was watching it fall apart, I was thinking that the restorative justice process might have been the wrong route to take here, because it set up a situation where I think the way restorative justice is supposed to work is the perpetrator is supposed to sit across the table from the victim, and the victim explains how they've been hurt by this. And who's the victim? It's the police.
Mm-hmm. Or the guy whose car got dinged up on Commercial Street.
But I think the way it was set up was the police and the DA's office were playing the role of the victim. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that in the pejorative sense. I mean they literally were being the victim. Right. And so that's already a little bit a weird theater. And then the other thing is these kids were not just they don't need to just have a nice conversation with Mike Sawchuk. They're protesting the way the whole system works. Mm-hmm. And this isn't going to get resolved over a table to see that he's a nice guy, which he is, and he is, as a public officials go, the one who I have the most confidence in dealing with matters of race in Maine, because mm-hmm. he seems to really have a strong understanding of how what the dynamics are. So I thought that it struck me. It was like somebody made a communications mistake. But we have to really guess because, among other things they don't trust, aside from the ACLU and the NAACP, it's the press. They don't talk to us. Right, exactly. So we have no idea what their position is.
Well, the bottom line is, though, that there was an understanding going in, which was negotiated at least by their attorneys, if not them, that this was the way it's going to be. And again, I go back to the whole point of public sentiment. And public sentiment, from my view, turned decidedly against them after this thing fell apart. If there were fundamental flaws in using restorative justice as a vehicle here, I think they shouldn't have agreed to that in the first place.
It seems to me there's a hazard with any grassroots movement, and that is that it gets hijacked by people who aren't necessarily representative of what, the impetus to the whole protest might have been. So, I mean, you see it with the Black Lives Matter movement, perhaps. I mean, if these people are acting unreasonably in this negotiation with the police chief, I mean, it's difficult to negotiate with a group to begin with, but it's unfortunate if the takeaway then from the public perspective is somehow the whole Black Lives Matter movement is less legitimate because you have
Right.
you know, and I think that's unfortunate. I see it now relative to like sort of this knee-jerk reaction to everything that the Trump administration does by some Democratic groups. It's the same thing. There's a couple of organizations that just make the rest of them look really bad. But I do think that the whole issue, restorative justice, I agree, probably wasn't the best model to use. But this whole issue of speech, I mean, we just keep talking about speech. This whole campaign and this whole election and now the post-election environment seems to be about the limitations on our speech rights and like what we can and cannot say or what we should and should not say. When we saw it out in California, the protests of this right wing, on Berkeley campus, it's an interesting dialogue.
I do think though that it began as a matter of speech, but what got them arrested was blocking traffic.
Right.
So I mean, and you can argue, so I suppose that blocking traffic is in itself a form of speech, but that night last summer in the Old Port, I don't think anybody was restricting their right to be heard. I think what they were saying was, okay, enough. You got to get out of the
Civil
street.
disobedience.
Yeah, right.
I was thinking of this in regard to the anti-war movement. We've kind of glossed over time where it was this broad-based movement with people just growing anger about the war and putting pressure on the government. And you forget that you had these sort of, middle-class moms who didn't want their kids to go to war, or people whose kids had been killed in the war, or, veterans. And then you'd also had people who wanted to tear down the capitalist system, who wanted to end imperialism. And they were, and
sounds like the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I mean, and they ran into
we have the anarchist wing.
ran into a lot of trouble, right? When some people are blowing up buildings and other people are having a peace vigil, they all get conflated. Yeah. And I guess if I had any kind of influence with these kids, I would say you need to talk to people, explain what your ideas are, because it's not apparent.
I remember when I was in college, I had a broken leg skiing, so I had my leg in a cast, and it was mid-April, Patriots Day, and Gerald Ford was coming to Concord to speak, and so a bunch of us from many, a couple thousand, a lot from UMass Amherst traveled to Concord to spend the night, terrible rainy night, on the bank across the river from where Ford was going to speak. And the morning came, and some of us tried to cross the river, and the police showed up in horses and, pushed them all back. And I'm standing there in a cast on the edge of the river, feeling very deprived because I can't go any further. But I remember and I was muddy and I was mad and all that. And finally the thing ends, and I hitchhiked home to nearby where my folks lived. And I remember my dad saying, so what were you protesting? Yeah. And I'll be honest, I was hard-pressed to tell him more. Nixon. He says, Nixon's gone. The war is over. So I think there's an element of that, is you really need to know specifically what you're out there for.
Yeah, and building on that point, I've been thinking a lot about how the Democratic Party is organizing, and others are organizing in opposition to Trump, and worrying a little that people are not going to carefully pick the battles. Right. Mm-hmm. That they're going to exhaust them. We're going to exhaust ourselves after 2 or 3 months of essentially opposing everything in a kind of undisciplined release of energy, and then the important stuff's going to come.
Right.
That that they're going to play through the cabinet picks and even the Supreme Court pick and all of these executive orders, but the really big stuff is coming.
And the burnout danger.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a great lead into our second topic, which I forgot to lay them out at the beginning. And we have 3 topics. We are organized this time, and it's the whole question of confirmations in the Senate and Susan Collins' role. But I think expanding on what you just said, how the Democrats are responding is a kind of a scattershot approach, right? They're responding to every single one, and really, should they be, or are they? What do we think of that? Are they doing the right thing?
Yeah, well, I certainly think it's a problem. I mean, I think it's a bit of a guerrilla war when you're on the outside. It's not the same game, and in guerrilla wars, the guerrillas pick their targets very carefully. Yeah. They know where the weak points are. They know where they have to win. They know where they can win a public relations battle. All of that stuff is analyzed, and decisions are made, real tough decisions. But you pick a spot, you put everything you have into it, and then you pull away. Yeah. And the Democrats or the opposition to Trump movement, which is very embryonic at the moment, is going to have to get to a level of sophistication where it is picking its targets and knowing when to let things go.
I think that there's a difference between how elected Democrats are reacting and how these organizations that are typically associated with Democrats are reacting. I mean, I see the Democrats in Washington as being pretty good at their messaging. I think their messaging around having a mainstream candidate for the Supreme Court has been good. I think Shelley Pingree's come out with some really meaningful anecdotes of how the Trump travel ban has impacted, real people and has spoken on the House floor. I think Susan Collins has done, in my view, an admirable job in, vetting the nominees, and in her case of Betsy DeVos taking I think a principled stand. I know a lot of people in my party perhaps disagree, but when it comes to the Supreme Court nomination, I mean, I'm sorry, I feel like the majority of people, in my view, want the Supreme Court to be full. They're worried about disruption in the world. They're worried about an erratic president, and they want 9 justices on the Supreme Court to be able to handle a constitutional crisis. So this knee-jerk reaction against Neil Gorsuch, I think, is a huge mistake. I just think it's a huge mistake. I mean, he, in my view, regardless of where he comes down exactly on, privacy and abortion and his vote on Hobby Lobby or his nuanced position on the right to die, I think, he's like normal. I mean, he's an educated, like mainstream,
he can put a sentence together,
absolutely qualified person, and it would be foolish, I think, to use only the fact that we got screwed from the Republicans by not putting Merrick Garland forward on a hearing. I think that alone isn't enough reason to prevent the Supreme Court from having a 9th justice at this time in history.
It certainly didn't affect the election.
Right.
Having that, this breach of history with Merrick Garland sitting in the sidelines.
No, in fact, they were rewarded for it.
But you know what I'm saying? I don't think anybody voted for, got extra motivated to vote for Hillary Clinton because of the Supreme Court seat.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you, Cynthia. I think that it's time to move on, and for if the Democrats were to so choose, to basically employ the same tactics or similar tactics to what the Republicans have spent the last year doing, I think it's a pox on all of them, and we really need to move on. And we should also note that Gorsuch is replacing Scalia.
Right.
So the balance of the court is going to be no different, realistically, than it was before Scalia died. The real battle is going to come if and when someone like Ginsburg or Kennedy decides to step down. Then that's when things, I think, get real serious. So I'd be careful about expending too much energy on this.
Yeah.
At this point.
But I mean, I think that, like, to Alan's point, what is that battle? Is that winnable? What would a win look like in fighting Gorsuch?
I think a win is just keeping the 60 vote rule. That's what the Democrats. That's their only win. Is that if they can preserve the rule that's in place now, that it takes 60 votes to confirm a United States court justice.
That's not their call. That's the problem. I mean,
no, but if they
make that decision.
No, I know, but he will only invoke the nuclear option if it's necessary. So the Democrats are in a position to negotiate something so that it takes 60 votes to put a justice on the Supreme Court, because that's the one piece of power that Democrats have. They have to hold on to it. So if they blow it on Neil Gorsuch and then he gets on the court and we don't have the filibuster, that to me is just a total failure.
Right, plus you've expended energy
Right.
on something that you probably can't win. It's probably a great trap
Right.
that's been set for Democrats.
Yeah, and then another
You know, it was a
justice
smart
dies,
move.
and all you need is 51 votes. I mean, then the Democrats are really screwed.
It's going to take a lot of acquiescence there because the filibuster is hanging by a very thin thread right now.
Yeah.
And I have no doubt at all of Mitch McConnell's willingness to employ the nuclear option here. I think
He certainly pretty much said as
we're-
much.
Yeah, we're headed that way.
Trump is egging him on.
Right,
So
right.
Right. I don't feel that great when I hear the president say, "I told him to go nuclear."
I know.
Like, you sound a little too comfortable with that.
At least he can pronounce it, though.
Yeah, that's true. Well, what about the cabinet nominees? How do you think that's playing out?
Well, I think DeVos is going to be really interesting once now that she's headed for a floor vote. And, is it going to be necessary for Mike Pence to come up to the Hill?
I hope so.
Or is there one more Republican vote out there? I applaud what Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski did. I think it was a real. Susan Collins'
Right.
floor speech was, I think, about as heartfelt as they come, saying, "I just cannot, in good faith, do this. This woman stands for this, this, and this, and that runs counter to any reasonable perception of public education." So, I certainly applaud her for that.
Absolutely, and this is another example, I think, where I'm troubled by some of the reaction by some of the far left wing of the Democratic Party that somehow describes Susan Collins voting DeVos out of committee but then not voting her on the floor as being cagey and having it both ways. I really don't see that at all. I see her consistently saying that people deserve to have a vote on the Senate floor, and then actually that it's more courageous to vote against someone who's inevitably probably going to be
Right.
in the position. It's easy to vote for someone who's, is obviously going to get the job, but to vote against someone who then you're going to have to work with in your own party, that's hard. And so I think her vote is not only correct, but that contrary to it being cagier on both sides of the fence, I feel like it's a pretty principled step.
She's getting hammered by readers. I was reading the letters today, who see this as just a setup by Mitch McConnell. Who knows how many votes he had to let go and gave permission to these two, knowing that they had 50 votes.
what's the evidence? Just speculation? Or?
We don't need evidence.
Yeah,
Right.
we're in a fact-free zone here.
Exactly, right.
No, but I'm wondering if anybody's presenting any evidence, or they're just surmising.
I think there's a story on Politico with some unnamed staffer who's kind of bragging that the Republicans have the votes. So we'll see, I guess, if there's another one out there.
Either way, this feels to me like a defining time for Susan Collins after all of this time she's been in office. Now we're seeing something that I think most Maine people will appreciate and will stay with her.
And that is running afoul of the Trump administration, because the one thing that does distinguish this from earlier political maneuvering like that is that she's going to vote against this education nominee on the record. That certainly is going to attract the notice of the White House. And going forward, I'm sure if she wasn't already, Susan Collins has been identified in Trump world as an enemy.
Right.
But I think what she has going for her, and this is what I think doesn't come across in the newspapers or on the TV, is that personal relationships is really what works in Washington and in politics. And so even though she's voting against Betsy DeVos, she's maintained the relationships with committee members by forwarding the nomination. She's certainly done everything she can to give this woman the respect that, she hasn't been name calling. I think she navigates
not Al Franken.
Exactly.
Right,
she navigates these things really well. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Trump administration really extended an olive branch or reached out to her to work with her going forward, as opposed to, I kind of don't sense that Donald Trump is going to come out and start tweeting about Susan Collins. I mean, maybe he will, but I just...
Well, that's what makes it so difficult, because who is going to make that determination at the White House? Steve Bannon?
Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult to read those tea leaves right now as to at what peril do you run counter to what this administration wants. I think we're still finding that out right now. So anybody that steps out from the crowd is potentially making him or herself vulnerable to that kind of attack.
On the other hand, how much more leverage could somebody like Susan Collins have right now? I mean, if they run her off or start to deride her publicly, you know,
That could
she's
be the
going to be
tipping point.
emboldened to take them on other issues. They only have 53 votes in the maximum, so they got to be careful about really agitating. Now, the Trump team has never been that intentional. I mean, they haven't really, in my mind, thought a lot of these spats out. But you have to hope that they're thinking this one through. They're going to lose some. They're going to lose some votes, so what? So move on. But, you know, if it's Trump tweeting at 3 o'clock in the morning when he's agitated, who knows what will happen. But I could see them driving Collins and maybe a few others right off the caucus. I mean, not out of the party, but ostracizing them in a way that they say, oh, really? Well, now I'm totally free to do exactly what I want to do. And the only thing I have to worry about is the conservative base back home.
Although I would add to that Susan Collins has a deeply abiding sense of devotion and loyalty to the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And if you speak to her about it in person, it really comes through. So if anybody would shudder at the thought of being considered, you know, a maverick or somebody that's bucking her party, she's it. I just don't think. I think that would be fundamentally a very hard thing for her to do.
Yeah.
I don't know, though. It would be, I think she's so astute politically that if she and a few others, like you said, who stand up to Trump, form some sort of caucus and have the ability to negotiate, I mean, that's a powerful position to be in. I mean, with the numbers being so tight, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Lindsey Graham, and John McCain, form a little
There's your 4 votes right
gang
there.
of
And you
4.
could argue that they have informally formed
Right.
that gang of 4, and maybe there'll be more. But I think I agree with you entirely. I think if we assume that she's voting on principle, which I do, the rest of it's out of her control. So I'm talking about a scenario in which the Trump team decides to play hardball and bullying and threatening with any of those 4. Because I think they'll hang together. And that could be disastrous to getting the bigger things done that they want later in the session. So we'll get to see how much they're thinking ahead.
Yeah, and I think the people who are criticizing Susan Collins should realize how unusual it is for a senator to vote against a nominee of president of their own party. I know we're in a lot of unusual circumstances now, but the last time a presidential nominee was voted down by a Senate that his party controlled was Calvin Coolidge.
Oh, Jesus.
So...
Wow. Well, and the other thing, I mean, this whole election has been so steeped in gender, and Donald Trump has put up so few women candidates, and there's just, this sea of, older white guys, no offense to the present company. So for Susan Collins the only person she votes against is one of the only women. That's another, it's like,
That's tough.
not that she would ever just use gender as a litmus test, but it's just one more factor. It's like,
the irony.
I know.
Right.
And I think it's also, what Alan just said, that it's a long game. I mean, these nominations are not sort of the end of it. It's kind of the prelude. It hasn't even really begun yet. The Supreme Court justice is probably more long game. But we have a third topic, which is
Ranked
choice
choice.
voting. The Senate, state Senate, took action today and voted to send ranked choice voting to the court. What do we think of that?
Pragmatically, I think it was a wise thing to do, because my feeling all along has been that this question of the constitutionality of this voter-passed statute is ultimately going to be decided by the main Supreme Judicial Court at some point. And if it doesn't happen now, the only time I could envision it happening would be immediately following a ranked choice election, in which a candidate who lost for the first time has the standing to bring it to the court. The problem right now is that nobody really has standing to sue.
Right.
But if you're a candidate who lost, you can show that you were damaged by this. So my point is simply, why not get this out of the way now, if the court's willing, which is another question, rather than have a primary or even general election 2 years from now, kind of put on suspension after the fact while we go to the court and figure out if it was a legal election after all. And if it wasn't, then what do we do? Yeah. We're not under that pressure right now. And it seems to me, again, if the court's willing, like an appropriate time to get them to weigh in on it.
I don't know. I think that it's just being used as a political maneuver to kill it. That they don't like this referendum outcome, that this is a good excuse to challenge the law, and that if they really wanted to make sure it's not constitutional, the legislature could amend the Constitution, to just change the language of plurality, whatever. So they really don't want to.
Well, we would have to do that too,
right? But if they want, but the people have decided in the ballot booth that they want this ranked choice voting. So if the legislature really wanted to just get it done and not have it be unconstitutional, they could try to make a fix. And I don't know. I question whether the court is going to accept it as a solemn occasion.
Yeah, that's the one fly in the ointment.
Because I can foresee, for instance, in the U.S. Senate race, if ranked choice voting applies and like 18 candidates come out of the woodwork and vote or, run against Angus King, he's still going to win by a majority. You know what I mean? So like it could be that still nobody has standing.
But look at the gubernatorial primaries. That's where I think it could really touch down.
It could, but I think I can see the court saying, look, we got to see how this plays out. I mean, we can't anticipate what the end game is. We have no idea what the result is going to be. We can't decide whether it's unconstitutional until we see how it works in a real situation. So I don't know. It's interesting.
It comes down to one. I think it comes down to one word, and that is plurality. What does that mean in the Constitution? Does that mean plurality, or does it mean a majority achieved through the ranked choice process? And I know that there are 4 questions that they're putting forth to the court, but I think essentially it comes down to that issue. Is the majority envisioned in ranked choice consistent with the plurality articulated in the Constitution?
See, I don't know. I just, on its face, that just seems to me like a kind of a bogus argument. Like, you can always have, if the constitutional floor is plurality, then it just strikes me as being obvious that to say it's a majority is okay too, because it's still a majority is a plurality. It'd be different if it was the other way around.
Well, the point is you had a plurality before you got that majority. Is the point? That's what the opponents argue. Is you already have a plurality in any election. So why doesn't that plurality count? It's a reasonable question, I think, and it's one that the court could at least, well, maybe not clarify, but at least make its feelings known on at this point. Maybe we like I said, it's a matter of timing. There's time to do that right now.
I mean, people are claiming that it's unconstitutional, but there's that hasn't been found.
Right. In fact, to the contrary, most court rulings have found that it is constitutional.
They've had similar cases in other places. So,
but I don't know what the language of those local or those local laws or state constitutions are. I mean, I don't know how comparable they are to Maine's situation.
Well, my point, and I don't mean to interrupt you, Alan, if you have something. My point is that I see this more as in keeping with sort of the Republican strategy to snuff out the referendum questions. They're attacking the minimum wage, the education one. They're going to go for this one. I just think it's more of an attempt to defeat it as opposed to sincere. I know that there is a sincere, curious question about the constitutionality of it, but I think the motivation behind the vote is more just, let's put this thing to bed and kill it.
I would not be surprised. You would know better than I, Cynthia, but I wouldn't be surprised if the court comes back and rules that it is constitutional. And so that effort's defeated. Now maybe they'll then have to do what they really want to do, which is to stand up and vote and remove it.
Right.
which they can always do.
It's
But
just
I don't
statute,
think there's
right? Yeah.
political courage to do that. But
Right.
it does concern me, this whole pattern of, I've never seen this quite this way, this simply ignoring popular votes.
Right.
Uh-huh.
As though they're advisory opinions.
Right.
That ought to be challenged.
Yeah.
Yeah, this
by the courts at some
assumption
point.
that the people didn't know what they were doing, particularly with the
With all the things they
tip
don't
wage
like.
credit.
Right, right.
Some of the language embedded in these referenda. That,
Right.
And then you get these learned arguments about how, the founders didn't trust the people, and this is a republic, and the same people who won elections,
Right.
who are now saying the voters they don't really run anything, and it's defending this kind of minority rule that we see in a lot of levels.
Well, and partisan gridlock.
Yeah, exactly.
In many ways.
Right.
I'm not saying what party it's ascribed to. I think it's the one that doesn't have the power, that has the most power. But in any case, there's so much gridlock in government that we're seeing more and more of these referendums. And if the response to the referendums is going to be, they don't matter,
Right.
that's a way of imposing gridlock on all the voters.
Right.
Right. Well, and especially because
Referendum lock.
before the referendum, there was plenty of information about the potential constitutional question. And people, I feel like, went in the voting booth knowing that, maybe it's not constitutional, but I don't think that it's a mandate for the legislature to put the brakes on the entire thing and to co-opt the process and to shape the questions and to have their sort of thumb on it. I think it should be decided by the court, but only after a ranked choice election has actually taken place, so we can see if anyone's actually been harmed or what the facts are, as opposed to.
Now, I've wondered, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I've wondered whether somebody is in an aggrieved party who anticipated being a candidate under the new system.
I don't believe, what I've read is that would not provide you for sufficient standing to go to court right now. And, that's why, again, I think, I agree, I think ranked choice voting is a good idea. My argument is rooted purely in pragmatism here, that let's get this obstacle out of the way
So we can
as
have it
quickly as possible so that we can
2018,
we can do this. And let's not have our
Yeah.
first election thrown into chaos
Well,
because
the whole process would be a nightmare.
yeah.
I mean, people would be spending money and time running for office, not knowing whether
Especially
if they
if it's-
win, they win.
Especially if it's a primary
Yeah.
and you've got 3.5, 4 months, or whatever, before the general election. And the clock is ticking while everybody waits for the law court to tell us whether that counted or not.
Well, see, that's
Yeah,
the thing.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
I think that bolsters the argument for the law court, hopefully not to take up the question, because I think this is, even if the law court takes up the question, it's still an advisory opinion. I mean, it's not. I just think it's going to not necessarily be the end of the problem. And if the law court decides it is constitutional, then there's less time to implement this system that's going to be totally complicated to begin with. So I don't know.
What if they just came out with an opinion in a month that said this looks constitutional to us? Wouldn't that just speed the process up of getting ready for the next election?
Yeah, I mean, if the law court can turn it around in a month, it seems a little unlikely because there'll be a briefing schedule and there'll be all kinds of people who want to weigh in, and there'll be then reply briefs and oral arguments that have to be
does it
scheduled.
follow that process on a solemn occasion, like it would a typical appeal?
That's what it did when the solemn occasion, that was most
Around the
recently
vetoes.
heard around the governor's vetoes. Yeah, there was a big briefing schedule, and then they had a big open court argument right in Portland.
Oh, right.
Cindy Montgomery
Yeah, yeah.
argued, and Holly Lusk, and the AG's office. And, it was sort of quick, but it wasn't that quick. I mean, it was a couple of months, definitely.
Well, what do you think about the bills to make it harder to get a referendum on the ballot? Any objections there?
I sort of support the one that says there has to be some representation from all the counties. I don't know if I agree with the numbers, but it does strike me as sort of weird that, these companies can just pay signature gatherers to walk around Old
Monument
Orchard
Square,
Beach
yeah.
and Portland and collect all these signatures to get a statewide referendum question. I can see how people from rural counties would be like, come on, that's not, I don't want to, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I have increasingly felt worried about the whole signature gathering process, not only in who does it and how well they're compensated for doing it. But what they say
Yeah.
and how the question is presented, there's that is such a loosey-goosey process right now that I think when it comes down, we mentioned earlier about voters not knowing what they're voting on. Well, through no fault of their own, I think a lot of voters don't know what they're signing when they sign some of these petitions. And I'm not sure how you might impose tighter controls on that process. But right now it really feels like the wild, wild west here in Maine, where, if you have enough money, if you want to build a casino, if you want whatever you want to do, if you want to shell out a few $1,000,000, you're on the ballot. And a lot of the people who put that question on the ballot really had no idea what it was they were endorsing with their signature.
The casino one is the most outrageous example, where it's written so that only one person can take advantage of the law.
And the guy
you had to have owned a casino racetrack in Bangor
and the
at
guy
a certain time, 2002.
The guy with the petition is saying, do you want to save the lives of harness racing horses in southern Maine?
Or what they told
But
me.
they keep getting
So it's
voted
like,
down.
do you want to have more money for education?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think that there's some good referendum questions, the minimum wage being one of them, of course, that I'd hate to see what I consider to be one of the only effective ways of legislating, it appears now, because of the gridlock. We do have this way of getting issues on the ballot, which is good. And I do think there's a little bit of karma around these casino people. I mean, if they want to spend $1 million in Maine, I guess maybe it's okay. But I sort of feel like it needs to be more spread out.
I'd like
around.
it if they bought newspaper ads.
Requiring them to
I
do
think
that
might
could
be a
be.
nice reform. I think
right.
Give them a page in the editorial section.
One full page a week. Twice a week in the month leading up to the election.
I
Just
did
kidding,
a-
folks.
I
That's
did a
not how
bunch
it
of-
works.
I think we have to have some change. I don't know what it is. But, I used to run referendums, so I'm a big, grassroots referendum supporter. But I think it's being taken away from us.
Yeah.
It's being bought
Yeah.
and paid for, and it's going to end up diminishing the view of referendums as an expression of popular will.
No, it's just going to become another facet of big politics.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think some radical things need to be done. I don't know what they are, and I don't know that there's the will in the legislature to do them, because if they're working for your party but not for the other, then you like them, and if it flips, then you hate them. So I hope there'll be a moment in time when both parties can understand the corrosion that's happening.
It could be a market thing, sort of, in that if the legislature continues to just ignore the outcome of referendum questions, then maybe we won't have as many of them. I mean, it just seems like if you are going to raise all this money to get a question on the ballot, and the chances are the legislature is just going to completely ignore the outcome. I don't know if people are going to invest in the system as much as they have been, but maybe they will.
That's when I guess we'll find out. So to wrap up, everybody got ideas for Sunday? You know what you're working on?
I'm working on the new demands on citizens and how much more we have to do right now to understand what it means to be an engaged citizen, and understanding history and what has happened around the world. And so I think, I want to write about raising the bar on citizenship somewhat.
That's interesting.
I'm getting historical too. My neighbor the other day brought me a book by Walter, very small book, on Liberty and the News by Walter Lippmann, written in 1920, right after World War I. And he's basically writing about that intersection between government and news, the news media, the press back then. And what strikes me about it, in addition to Lippmann's eloquence, is how much of it is immediately transferable to what's happening today. We think going through this period of crisis that, American civilization has never faced such a challenge before as we do now. But if you read this and other things like it, you'll find that there's actually a cyclical nature to a lot of this.
Like a pencil skirt.
We've been there before, and I'm going to have some fun lifting Lippmann quotes and dropping them into 2017.
Oh, that's good.
That does sound good. I think I'm going to write about the nomination by President Trump of 10th Circuit Court Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, and why I think he will be the 9th member, and should be, I might add.
All right.
Is that an endorsement?
Yeah.
You'll have to read the column. That's my teaser.
I couldn't hear anything you said after President Trump.
I know.
It still gets the subway running through my head. I don't write till Tuesday, so I may be subject to change. But I'm interested in the whole American manufacturing future, and I was looking online for American-made goods, and I found this place that sold these T-shirts, 100% made in America in North Carolina. It's like they have a great story. They've reclaimed an old textile plant. They weave the cloth there. They cut them. They're like $35 a T-shirt. So, or I could go to Rennie's and I could buy one for $5.
How bad do you want it?
And they're workers too.
Yeah.
The people who work at Rennie's are really, are working class Americans, and
the 5-year-old who made the T-shirt.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess that's, but in terms of and so for one thing, there's the moral question about where you're spending your money, and then there's also can you imagine a lot of our lifestyle has been financed by low prices over the last few decades. Wages have been pretty stuck, but prices have gone down. If you think about what your grandparents paid for a pair of shoes compared to what we pay, right. It's there's no comparison. So, what would happen if we really started paying the real price of things that real people made, so that they could live a good life? You'd have one T-shirt in your drawer. Anyway.
That sounds like a good column.
Okay.
I look forward to it.
All right. Well, and I think that's it for today.
All right. Have a good week.
Thanks. You too.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Portland Press Herald podcast. Make sure you never miss a podcast episode by subscribing on iTunes or your favorite podcast aggregator. For more of our podcasts, visit pressherald.com/podcasts. Follow the link there to this episode to leave a comment. You can also leave a comment on our Facebook page. I'm Chad Gilley. Once again, thank you for listening to the Portland Press Herald podcast.